And Amanda, do you want us to all go, I assume, on mute and turn off our cameras until we're on and ready, till we're up?
Yep, that sounds good.
Great.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the three-part web series focused on rural broadband. We'll be getting started here pretty soon. If you can mute your microphones and also turn off your cameras, unless you are a speaker, that will be super helpful. We encourage you to use the chat feature for questions, and we will begin shortly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Amanda McEldowney with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Thank you all for joining us today for the three-part web series focused on rural broadband. My colleague Joe Garrity is running a few minutes late from another meeting, but he will join us in just 1 to 2 minutes and do a quick welcome. Then we'll turn it over to our presenting sponsor, Spectrum, to provide a welcome. But if everyone will just hang tight and remember to use the chat feature to ask any questions that you may have. Okay, it looks like my colleague Joe was able to pop on. So Joe, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you to do a welcome on behalf of MORPC, and then you can turn it over to Brian.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you. My name is Joe Garrity. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Community Relations at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, or our friends call us MORPC. And so it is officially Infrastructure Week, and with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this is a pivotal bill that will have a profound impact on our region and across the country. And so we're excited that you can join us, and we're thankful for the partnership with Spectrum as well. And so before we get started, I just wanted to talk about this bill in the sense that there's a unique opportunity. There's $65 billion within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we can really dive into and be helpful to our members on. And so within that, there's several different buckets of opportunity. So of that 65 billion, there's 42.45 billion that's dedicated to grants to states for deployments. There's $2 billion for tribal grants, $2.75 billion that includes digital equity, 14.2 billion on affordability. And so again, on the broadband front, and we're focusing specifically today on rural broadband, is there's just a unique opportunity to help some of our rural communities expand and have better high quality broadband to make life a little bit easier. And this issue only became more profound at the outset of the pandemic almost 2 years ago now. And so what I wanted to inform everyone today is, as we transition from advocacy to implementation at MORPC, we stand ready to be a resource. And so I wanted to let you guys know that as MORPC's role as an MPO and as a regional convener, we stand ready to bring back this investment to Central Ohio. So it doesn't matter if it's elevated formula funding as an MPO or these new discretionary competitive grants programs, we're here to help. And so we're going to be cultivating a bring back the investment back to Central Ohio. And we're also going to hire a grants officer that will be dedicated solely to bringing this investment back to your communities. And so as we work in alignment and in partnership with the federal government, use us as a resource. We will be that intergovernmental liaison, because there are just so many opportunities that our rural communities can take advantage of at both the federal level with the infrastructure bill, at the state level with House Bill 2 passing and the dollars that were in the state operating budget. And so we're just here to help. And so really excited and thankful that you could join us today. And I'll turn it back to our team for the remainder of the event. So thank you again.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Joe. I'm Brian Young, Director of Government Affairs for Charter Communications. Charter Communications and our Spectrum brand of services is pleased to be able to sponsor today's event in partnership with MORPC. Today's topic about rural broadband expansion, specifically here in Central Ohio, is a significant focus for Charter. The pandemic has highlighted the need for broadband availability and adoption, and Charter is committed to furthering those efforts as part of a comprehensive solution needed to address and positively impact the local communities we serve. And as Americans across the country increasingly rely on broadband to work, learn, access healthcare, and stay in touch with family and loved ones, bringing broadband access to more unserved areas is a priority. As Joe mentioned, the recently passed infrastructure bill, as well as the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, and Broadband Ohio's residential grant program, as you mentioned, House Bill 2. All of these will be kind of featured today in today's session, and Charter is really excited to be participating. Communities on the technology divide is also an important part of what Charter does. We participate in the FCC's Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. Spectrum also offers a low-cost broadband service called Spectrum Internet Assist. And we also work through our Spectrum Digital Education grants to kind of help nonprofit organizations educate the community on how to use broadband. These are just a few of the community impact programs that we have. During the month of November, Charter's been recognizing our nation's, and more specifically our company's, veterans. Here at Charter, our commitment to transitioning service members, veterans, Guard, Reserve members, military spouses, and their families is strong, and we join the nation in honoring the veterans this month. In fact, nearly 1 in 10 of our employees here at Charter have a military connection, and we're really proud of their strong work ethic and the diversity they bring to our company. We're also proud to have recently been named one of America's best employers for veterans by Forbes. So again, on behalf of Charter Communications and all of our Spectrum brand of services, we want to thank MORPC for offering this webinar today, and we're pleased to be able to sponsor today's event. Now I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Aaron Schill.
All right, thank you, Brian. And it's great to be here. Hi to those of you that I've met before, and welcome to everyone on the call. It's great to be joining MORPC webinar again from the West Coast now for myself. I'm going to give just a very quick breakdown of what we'll go through for the next 45 minutes to an hour of our conversation, and then we'll start out with an overview of kind of thinking about broadband for rural communities, and then we'll hear presentations from our panelists, and then move into some moderated discussion and have plenty of opportunity for chat and for Q&A from our audience. So throughout the conversation, as Amanda mentioned earlier, please use the chat feature to send any questions you might have throughout the initial presentations and throughout the panel discussion, and we'll make sure to get to those in the moderated Q&A portion of our webinar this morning. So to begin, I thought it might be useful to provide an overview of broadband planning for rural communities. There's a lot going on. I know that you all are hearing a lot, both within your communities, from your residents, from other partners in your communities, and hearing a lot about different funding and programs at the same time that new technologies and new strategies are rolling out. So we recognize that there's just a lot going on, and that we need to think about how to implement this technology, how to make sure that we're covering as many residents and community members as possible. And so I thought I would give an overview kind of broadband planning from a rural perspective to think about how to do that. But before we get into kind of how to strategize and how to plan for implementing and rolling out broadband service and associated supports throughout your community, I thought we should just do a little bit of level setting first. So as I said, we know that there are a lot of terms. There's new technologies coming out seemingly all the time. And so I wanted to just do a little bit of level setting for folks that may be hearing some of these terms and not quite sure what each means or how to differentiate. So the first is the most basic, just the definition of broadband. So broadband, and I know a lot of folks on this call will know this, but just want to, again, level set. Broadband is defined by the FCC as basically just internet service. It's essentially just high-speed internet service. So internet service with download speeds of at least 25 megabits per second and upload speeds of at least 3 megabits per second. Anything below that threshold is not considered broadband service. However, we think that's going to be changing soon. So that has been the definition for the past 6 or so years. But technology is advancing quickly, and there are actually certain funding programs that require higher speeds than that for projects to be eligible. And so we have heard some interest among congressional representation in increasing the speeds of what's considered the minimum to qualify as broadband. We have heard up to 100 symmetrical service, so that would be 100 download and 100 upload speeds. There's some interest in that, or something along those lines. So we may see things moving in that direction as both technology increases, but also demand within households and demand for businesses and others increases, needing to increase those speeds. So let's talk just very quickly about what some of the technologies are. You may be hearing about some of these and not quite sure how to differentiate or what's what. But essentially, we group broadband into two major buckets, and then there are some different technologies under those buckets. So the first is fixed broadband. That's essentially wires coming into your home or business. And that breaks down into a few categories. So there's DSL, which runs over phone lines generally. There's cable, which, as it sounds like, runs over cable lines. And then there's fiber, and that is fiber optic cable, all of which go directly into your home or business. You can see the diagram on the top left is essentially a fiber to the home diagram and kind of what that network looks like. The key for any of these is it's important to have, and especially for fiber, it's important to have high density, relatively high density, because you're putting lines into each individual home or business, which makes it relatively expensive to build, especially when you're in rural areas where you may have significant gaps between places, when you may have only 5 or 10 households per mile. It gets very expensive to build that infrastructure. In a lot of places, with telecom build out, DSL is available. In many rural areas, DSL may be the only option available right now for wired internet. We see more cable and providers are building out more fiber, but that's going to be a process that takes time. Generally, fiber is considered the fastest available internet right now, and can reach speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second, which is a little more than 1,000 megabits per second. And so that is significantly faster than DSL or cable. Cable can also easily reach those minimum thresholds now, but as those thresholds for broadband increase, DSL becomes increasingly less viable, and at some point we'll start to see cable becoming less viable just because the amount of data that can be passed through can't reach those increasing thresholds that we might see and what those demands are. So fiber, in terms of fixed broadband, is really the direction things are going. It's where we see a lot of investment happening, and where we'll see a lot of discussion in the new funding that is available. So let's move on to wireless broadband. Wireless broadband comes in a lot of different forms. It's essentially just broadband that is not coming into your home or business through a direct cable. So that can come through the form of mobile hotspots. So you see on the top right, an example of a mobile hotspot at a school. A mobile hotspot can either be a standalone device like that, or it can be your cell phone. Either way, those operate over cell networks. And generally, those can and do reach that minimum definition of broadband, but usually max out at about 50 megabits per second. So while it meets the current definition, if we're moving in the direction of 100 or more megabits per second, then we start to see mobile hotspots drop off. In rural areas, obviously, cell phone coverage kind of depends on where you are, especially when terrain becomes an issue. And certain cell providers are going to have better coverage in some areas than others. Closely related to that is 5G, which is essentially just fifth generation cell networks. So that is essentially very high speed cell service. The key with 5G, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it is particularly challenging in rural areas, is whereas traditional 3 and 4G networks have large cell towers that cover large areas, 5G network requires very close small cell towers that are very close together. And as you can imagine, just like building fiber to homes, if you need cell towers that are a quarter mile or a few hundred or 1,000 yards apart, that becomes very difficult to do over large, sparsely populated areas. So while 5G is an important technology, it's one that we want to keep an eye on and continue to encourage. That's not where we're going to spend most of our time talking about for rural broadband implementation. And then a few others that I'll just touch on quickly. Wi-Fi service. Many of us have Wi-Fi in our homes to connect devices. Suffice to say, Wi-Fi can also work the same way outside of your home and bringing signal into your home or business. We see in urban areas, particularly both private internet service providers and public sector in some cases, implementing public Wi-Fi or publicly accessible Wi-Fi, whether that is for free or for a cost. Essentially, that's just sending out a signal that anyone with a Wi-Fi enabled device can tap into. Sometimes there's a protected network, sometimes that's an open network. I'll come back to fixed wireless in a moment because I think that's the one that we really want to focus some conversation on today. And I'll touch quickly on satellite service. You see in the bottom right an example of the Starlink satellite internet setup, which comes out of SpaceX, and we have there's an exciting pilot in Ohio. We're starting to see that rolled out and expanding. It is an encouraging new technology that is particularly a good option in rural areas where wired or other fiber service may or may not exist. It is relatively expensive still. I think a setup is somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 for the initial equipment, and then a bit more than other forms of service on a monthly basis. But the technology is promising, and it's something that we'll want to continue to keep an eye on and is worth exploring in your own communities as well. And then fixed wireless is the one I'll touch on a little bit more. You can see on the bottom left a diagram of essentially how fixed wireless works. There is a point often on a cell tower or other kind of vertical feature that can provide good line of sight to an area, somewhere in the neighborhood of a mile or a couple mile radius around that point. And essentially, anyone receiving service from that fixed wireless provider will have an antenna at their home, and it's sending a signal from that fixed wireless point directly to people's antennas. So the difference between that and Wi-Fi is it's not just sending out a general signal that anyone taps into from their device. It's sending a signal directly to a receiver in your home or business, which is then wired to a modem within your home, and then it kind of works just like cable or fiber or other service within your home. There are a number of different technologies of fixed wireless. I'm not going to get into those now, but you may hear people talk about private LTE networks. You may hear people talk about CBRS, which is a newer opportunity that is available that has some good promise as well. You may also hear about millimeter wave technology and a few other versions, mesh networks, some other versions. We're not going to get into detail. I just want to kind of mention those. So when you hear them, you kind of think, oh, that's fixed wireless, and can explore that a little bit more if you're interested. So why don't we go on to the next slide? Again, just wanted to kind of lay some basic foundation. And now we'll talk a bit more about doing broadband planning in rural communities. So this first slide about planning is essentially just kind of an outline of the different components that you may want to think about when undertaking a community broadband plan. We really encourage communities to consider developing a broadband plan before jumping into implementation. Now is the perfect time to do this because, as Joe mentioned, there are a lot of dollars available, and I'll get into more of the funding opportunities at the end of these slides. But there are a lot of dollars available, and communities that are well positioned with a plan and solid implementation strategies are going to be best positioned to compete for those funds and to implement the funds that do come into their community. So we would strongly encourage folks to consider developing a broadband plan. So let's talk about what goes into that. The first, and we would say one of the most important pieces, is stakeholder and community engagement, making sure that you are thinking about and bringing input from across your community, from both the obvious and maybe some of the less obvious partners and stakeholders in this process. And the one thing I'll mention for this, and the reason I put this first in the process, is doing this early can make the rest of your job easier. So as we walk through the other bullet points, if you begin with stakeholder and community engagement, you'll have partners and stakeholders that can help do some of these other pieces for you or help support your work in developing some of these other really key elements to the planning process. So data collection is really key as well. And that takes a few different forms that we'll touch on. Can often be one of the biggest challenges right now, as broadband implementation is relatively new in terms of infrastructure for a lot of communities. Collecting good data and understanding the current conditions on the ground can be one of the most challenging pieces. Again, relying on community partners and stakeholders can really make that job easier for you. Also want to make sure that we think about digital inclusion, and I'll explain what that is here in a couple of slides. And then moving on to network planning and implementation strategies. This is really kind of planning out incrementally what the rollout of broadband will look like, how you will work with partners, and how you will identify projects to implement for broadband in your community. And then one thing we would encourage is considering using a consultant to do this work. There are some consultants that MORPC does not do broadband planning work directly, but we would be happy to support our member communities with certain elements, and I'll call some of those out where you might want to call on MORPC for some support. But if you're doing a comprehensive or a community broadband plan, there are some consultants that do really good work in this space. Offline, I'm not necessarily going to call out specifics now because I don't want to leave anyone out, but offline, would be happy to make some suggestions for consultants to reach out to, even to just help kind of think through how do we put together an RFP, or how do we consider going about doing this. Issuing an RFP is always a good way to go about getting a number of responses as well. So we would encourage considering that to help your community advance this work. Let's move to the next slide. And now we'll move through the different elements of the broadband plan. I'll touch on some of these quickly and then break a few down in a little bit more detail. So for convening stakeholders and partners, I just wanted to kind of provide a not comprehensive, but a pretty good list to get started with for who you'd want to engage in this process. So some of these are going to be, like I said before, obvious. Some of them may be a little bit less obvious. And you'll have others in your community. This is a community by community consideration. And so there may be some organizations that are not on here that would make sense in your community. But this is really just intended to kind of help folks get started thinking about who to engage in these conversations. So certainly some of the obvious, like local governments, regional agencies like MORPC, we would strongly encourage you to get in touch with Broadband Ohio. Peter Voderberg, who heads up that office, is a fantastic resource and a very strong advocate at the state level for broadband implementation. They will also be responsible for administering a number of the grants in Ohio. A lot of the federal dollars come through the state and then will be administered and distributed locally from the state. So would strongly encourage, if you haven't already, developing a relationship with Broadband Ohio. And then school districts and libraries as key anchor institutions. They're going to be really critical. They have some of the most pressing needs for strong broadband service. They also are a resource for a lot of members of the community and how people that may not have access at home, how folks are able to get connected. Within the private sector, we'll hear from a couple of panelists, one who represents an economic development organization and one who represents an ISP. So obviously those are key partners. You may think about others that we have listed here. What I would encourage is think about who has a vested interest in your community, in the business community, who has a vested interest in implementing broadband throughout the community, who would be key allies, who has resources and expertise. Healthcare providers, hospital systems are really critical. Just to kind of think about, obviously resident groups and engaging citizens can be really key in understanding what are their challenges, what are their needs, who is really struggling to get access. There can be very small pockets in the community, especially out in the county areas and township areas. It's really key to engage resident groups. They're often kind of the ones that are pushing this, and you'll, in some communities, we'll actually see resident groups getting together and driving and in some cases even implementing solutions for themselves. But definitely encourage early and often engagement with citizens. And then you'll see a big list on the right-hand column of nonprofit and other kind of partners. Again, this may be where there are some a little bit less evident and less obvious partners like faith-based organizations, like organizations that serve certain groups like older aging adults, the senior population, people with certain disabilities. Oftentimes, these organizations are already helping to connect their constituents and the folks that they work with. And they may not even think about their work as really being related to broadband or digital inclusion. But in reality, that is often a key role that they serve for the folks that they work with. And then certainly foundations and others who can help fund and help support the work that you're doing. So this is, again, not a comprehensive list, but hopefully enough to kind of get you started thinking about who in your community you'd want to reach out to. So let's move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about collecting data and understanding what assets you have and can build on. As I mentioned, this can be one of the bigger challenges to get started, particularly understanding existing access and adoption rates. So there are some resources out there, but we also know that this is an area where data is insufficient right now. There are a lot of efforts being made to improve that, but it's taken some time, and there are certainly some gaps. So I wanted to call out some of the best resources that are available. But I will also note here that this is an area where you can draw on MORPC's expertise in both data and mapping, particularly for our smaller member communities that may not have the ability to pull data to map it in a way that's really useful. MORPC can provide some support there. I will give a quick plug reminder to all MORPC member communities. You have some technical assistance coming to you that's part of your MORPC membership. Hint, this could be a great way to use those technical assistance resources, supporting your own community and understanding what coverage looks like, what adoption rates look like in your community. So the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau provides a number of different data sets that look at adoption rates, that look at access to computers in homes. And so you can get an idea at the census tract and block group level in your community about what percentage of households have access to internet, have computers at home, and have other devices. This isn't going to tell you on a house-by-house basis who does and doesn't have coverage, but it will help you kind of think about where do we have the most challenges, where do we have the most people that are uncovered, and can to help to surface some of those. The FCC Form 477 is basically coverage mapping of the entire country. Internet service providers are required to provide mapping of the services they offer and the speeds at which that service is offered. And so that's available to look at and see where there is coverage in your community. And Connect Ohio has done a good job of supplementing that with input from internet service providers to make sure that those maps are as accurate as possible for Ohio. Connect Ohio did that in about 2017. So in a number of places, service providers have built out more of the network, so that that may be a little outdated in some places, but the FCC data is updated twice a year. And in fact, new data came out, I believe, 2 weeks ago. So the data from the FCC should be pretty up to date. And then there's also speed test data, and this is an area that's exciting. It's developing quickly. This is essentially crowdsourced data. So you as a user can test your own internet speeds. You may have seen tests from Ookla, tests from MLab. They pop up on different websites, or you can go to the FCC, has their own tool that you can use to map this. And you can essentially test your own internet speed. It's a great way. I would encourage you to do it just to make sure you're getting the level of service that you think you should be getting from your provider. But it's just a great way to also collect data at a very granular level to understand what do speeds look like in different parts of your community. The link you see next, and this is what I really want to draw your attention to, this is a map developed by NTIA, which is another federal agency that is responsible for managing both implementation and funding for broadband. They've developed a mapping resource that's really fantastic. It's pretty new. It just rolled out recently. And you see a picture of it on the right. Essentially, what this mapping resource does is it pulls together information from the American Community Survey, from those FCC maps and speed test data, and puts it all in one place for you. So I provided a link to that. I would really encourage you to start there. If you want to explore some of those other resources on their own, that can be useful as well. But this is a resource, if you're going to have one go-to, this is a great place to start mapping what broadband coverage and adoption rates look like in your community. And then I've got a bullet here to think about gathering your own data too. So all of those data sets that I just mentioned have their pros and cons. Some of them are not as granular as we would like. Some of them can get outdated. Some of them just have issues in kind of how the data is collected and reported that may or may not tell you exactly what you need to know about coverage in your community. And so a lot of communities find it helpful to collect some of their own data as well. So that can look, there are kind of two primary ways that communities are doing this. The first is just general community surveys, asking residents who is covered, who is not covered, what type of service they have. So how fast are their speeds, how many households are above that threshold of 25.3 to meet the federal definition of broadband, how many are below that, asking them what type of service they have. So who has fixed wireless versus DSL versus fiber, for example. There are a lot of different questions, and again, MORPC would be a good resource to kind of help think through potentially what you would want to ask of your community. But that's a great way to kind of understand at a more granular level what type of service people have and where the needs exist. Similarly, some communities are setting up speed tests for themselves rather than strictly relying on those large national data sets from the organizations I mentioned previously. Some communities are implementing their own speed tests. Can be done relatively inexpensively and just a way to collect more granular data and more targeted data to your community. So that's the one side. That's kind of all about understanding needs, understanding existing adoption rates and access to service. But when you're thinking about planning for your community, the other piece you'll want to do is understanding what assets you have and can build on. And so this is really key to help expedite implementation in your community, building out infrastructure. You want to use and leverage those assets you already have. So some examples of a couple of those are mapping out the existing broadband infrastructure in your community. There's a picture of OrNet on the bottom right here. OrNet, if you're not familiar, is essentially a high-speed backbone fiber network that connects, initially was built to connect educational institutions, higher education throughout the state. It is now working with other institutional partners as well, so it's available to healthcare providers, to schools and libraries, and to other users as well. But essentially a very high-capacity, high-speed network running throughout the state. That can be, if it runs through your community or near your community, that can be a great way to tie into backbone fiber, which is kind of the most critical piece to get really high-capacity, high-speed service out into a community. And then from there, you're essentially thinking about building what we call middle and last mile fiber, which is kind of the last piece to get out to either more remote areas of a community or to individual households. But if you can build on an existing asset like that backbone fiber, that's really a great start, and will cut down the implementation cost significantly. Other things to think about that may not be broadband specific, but could be assets to build on are vertical assets that you could use for implementing fixed wireless service. As I mentioned, fixed wireless works with a direct line of sight from a location to from a tower to a receiver in different people's homes. And so you really want to identify vertical assets where you can put that fixed wireless equipment that will be able to see and send an uninterrupted signal out to a large number of homes and businesses. So using existing cell towers, using public buildings or water towers or other things that are in the public realm that your community can leverage as an asset is a great way to work with providers to get those built. You also want to think about device providers. Who are there refurbishers? Are there other folks in your community that you could work with to provide devices to people that need them? Because often if you don't have internet service, you may or may not have a computer at home to take advantage of it. So it doesn't help you a whole lot if you can get really high-speed service if you don't have the right kind of device to access and leverage that resource. And then finally, digital inclusion providers. So who is doing work in your community to work on digital literacy training? Who's already working with their constituents or who potentially is well positioned to do that? So think about libraries, think about schools and other folks you can leverage to help skill building and help people feel comfortable accessing and utilizing internet that may not have it at home now. So moving on from there, I want to talk a little bit more about digital inclusion. So let's go to the next slide. And While infrastructure is getting a lot of the attention, understandably, especially in rural communities where we still don't have an entire network built out, there are still people who cannot access high-speed internet at home. Infrastructure is getting a lot of the focus, and that's understandable. That said, digital inclusion includes more than strictly access to affordable and robust service. That is one of kind of 5 elements of digital inclusion. And while a lot of us need to be focused on building that infrastructure network out in our communities, it's important not to forget about the other 4 aspects of digital inclusion at the same time. Because, as I said, if you build this system, but people don't have access to internet-enabled devices, if they don't have the training that they need and the skill building they need to take advantage of those, if they don't have adequate tech support, and if they don't have an understanding of the applications and programming software that they need to do what they need to do, then just building the infrastructure isn't going to be enough. So this is not a case where if you build it, they will come is going to completely satisfy all the need that's out there. Again, that's an important step, but we want to make sure folks are thinking about these other elements of digital inclusion at the same time. So just like building out the infrastructure piece, developing a strong ecosystem for digital inclusion is also a process. It's going to take time. This is where you can really leverage and rely on those stakeholders and community partners to help advise and to help build capacity in this space. I'll also point to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. That's a national nonprofit organization that has really fantastic expertise in this space about bringing community members along and getting people online, getting them engaged, making sure that communities have the right supports and the right strategies in place. In fact, there's a Digital Inclusion Coalition guidebook. One of the ways that you can really advance this work is to develop or support a digital inclusion or digital equity coalition in your community. We're starting to see more of these pop up in communities throughout Ohio. There are some in the Cleveland area. There's been one in place for years. They've built a lot of capacity and have pretty sophisticated strategies to engage community members. There are a lot of newer ones in Franklin County. The Digital Inclusion Coalition has been around for not quite a year. We're starting to see them pop up in Toledo and other places. To this point, so far, less so in rural communities, but the need is just as strong. It's just as important in rural communities. So would really encourage you to think about either building or supporting efforts that may be led by others in your community in this space. So let's move on to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about implementation and how you kind of think about rolling out and developing projects and getting that infrastructure system built out in your community. So the first thing I would encourage is take advantage of existing programs and resources. So we should absolutely be leveraging and jumping on the low-hanging fruit that is out there. So we heard in the intro reference to a couple of these that I want to call back to. The first is low-cost offerings from internet service providers. Spectrum has their Internet Assist program. If you have AT&T in your community, they also have a low-cost offering. Those are the 2 low-cost offerings kind of in the central Ohio area from internet service providers. These are really fantastic for people that are income eligible to qualify. This gets them broadband service for somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 or $20 a month, which can be as little as 20% of the cost of market rate service. So really encourage increasing awareness of those low-cost offerings, encouraging people to see if they qualify, and working with your internet service providers to raise awareness, get word out in your communities. The other that you may have heard of is the emergency broadband benefit. So this grew out of one of the COVID response bills. And is essentially a direct subsidy to pay for internet service for lower income households as well. The subsidy, the way it works is that families or households apply for the EBB, as you'll hear it called. They sign up for the program through an internet service provider, and then the subsidy is paid directly to the provider. So this kind of cuts out the middleman. It makes it easy for everyone. So families can sign up with their provider, and if they're eligible, they can get the EBB benefit. And some or all of their monthly internet bill will then be paid for through that. We have seen encouraging expansion of that program and expect to continue to see ongoing subsidy of that into the future. Just like the low-cost offerings from internet service providers, one of the keys here that we would really encourage is getting word out, making sure people are aware of this. Ohio has been doing very well in comparison to other states. I haven't checked for a little while, but for quite a while, we were in the top couple of states in terms of per capita usage of this program. There is a kind of an overall pot of money that's available, and when it's gone, it's gone. So we want to encourage our residents to take advantage of this and utilize those resources as long as they're available. So again, while you're thinking about building infrastructure, while you're thinking about these other strategies, making sure that you're leveraging those resources that are already out there that can meet needs of people that may just not know that support is available to them. Additionally, when I talked about inventorying your assets and kind of leveraging your resources that are available, you'll want to roll that into your implementation strategies and kind of think about how do we leverage those resources and develop new projects? Who can we partner with to develop projects? So just to kind of give an idea of what that might look like, looking at public-private partnerships and ways to leverage public resources and public assets to bring down the cost of building infrastructure. As we know, at the end of the day, building out infrastructure for broadband in rural communities in a lot of ways just comes down to cost and bringing down the cost of building out that network in areas that are a little less populated. So if there are public assets available to help bring down those costs, like I said, if you have water towers that throughout the community that you can use to put in fixed wireless, if there are ways that you can leverage existing backbone going into a school or a university or a library or a hospital and cut down the cost for an internet service provider that may be looking to build fiber, those are all great options. Some electric companies are building high capacity fiber out to their own substations. So you may want to talk to the electric company in serving your community, whether that is one of the large electric providers, whether that is a co-op. You may look at them as potential partners to help with some of that backbone and even middle mile fiber. That would then allow an internet service provider maybe to just kind of worry about that piece, getting it from that backbone or middle mile fiber, that last little stretch out to people's houses. So anything you can do to cut down on the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built or cut down on the cost of building that infrastructure can be really key. And we would encourage you to embrace creative solutions. So we've seen some great pilots pop up throughout the state of Ohio. I mentioned the Starlink pilot. There are some other kind of community scale broadband efforts that are happening. Again, utilize MORPC as a resource. One of the things that we can do is make connections, and we kind of, with that regional perspective, we may hear about things happening in other communities that you may want to consider for yours. At the same time, we'd also encourage you to consider different policy solutions that can help with build out over time. Now, these may not get you immediately closer to building out your infrastructure network, but over time they're going to support that and help with that. So one of those is we would encourage every community to consider adopting a local version of MORPC's Smart Streets policy. So what the Smart Streets policy is essentially a little more robust version of a dig once policy. So essentially saying whenever there is a public investment in streets, in any other infrastructure, utilities that causes you to dig up a street, when you're replacing that, communities should think about putting in conduit, should think about putting in fiber or other broadband assets while a street is already torn up or while the right-of-way is torn up. If you already have it opened up, consider putting in those assets. This is common for other utilities, so dig once policies are already in place for electric, for water and sewer in some communities. So we would encourage you to think about rolling that out for broadband and fiber infrastructure as well. Another piece that you might consider is putting an ordinance in place that either limits or prevents exclusivity agreements in multifamily developments. Essentially, this is an agreement that makes it so that only one provider can serve a multifamily development. One of the things that we at MORPC encourage is encouraging more options available to people, to residents. So that is going to ensure that the best access is available and that residents can get the best deal available to them. So if folks have a couple of options of internet service providers, that's been shown to really boost the service levels that they have, to boost speeds and through competition. And that's something that MORPC really would encourage. So you might think about an ordinance that would either restrict or prevent those types of exclusivity agreements that are in place in a number of multifamily developments. And then the last piece is, think about this. This is a long-term strategy. So think about layered solutions. What you build right now may or may not be the permanent long-term solution. We often talk about fiber as being future-proof because there is really almost exponential capacity compared to other technologies, other broadband options. So while fiber we kind of think of as a very long-term solution, it's also one of the most expensive and one of the most challenging in rural communities, as you saw from the little network diagram earlier. So you might need to think about short and medium-term solutions while you are also pursuing that longer-term comprehensive infrastructure build-out. So if that means, the shortest term might be providing hotspot devices or other kind of public Wi-Fi options where people can come to schools, libraries, or other places and access public Wi-Fi. We would not suggest that that is a permanent solution for people in need of broadband, but it might be something that works for now. MORPC put in place a broadband pilot program last year that provided hotspot devices to K through 12 households with this exact idea in mind, that this is not the permanent solution for folks that need broadband, but we have kids that are last year were in remote schooling and didn't have any other option. And if we could provide them a short-term solution that got them online, got their household connected, then that's something we want to pursue while we're going for these longer-term funding options and developing these longer-term plans. So what we know, technology turnover is quick. So even if you put something in place that is kind of that short or medium-term solution, the lifespan of that technology might be 3 years, might be 5 years. And by the time the useful life of that particular technology solution has been expended, you may be ready to move on to the next thing, which may be fiber, maybe a new later generation of either 5G or fixed wireless service or some other service for communities. So think about kind of layering this. And just because you don't have the ultimate solution and comprehensive build out right away doesn't mean that there aren't options in the interim that would work for your community. And we'll move on to my last slide, and this is kind of the one that we want you to keep in mind and reference back to as much as you may need to. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So this is your list of funding programs and opportunities. You'll see a number of links here, and there are actually some links throughout the rest of the slide deck as well. We'll share this out. We want this to be a resource for you. We want you to be able to go back. I don't expect that everyone is going to memorize all of the components of a broadband plan, all of those data resources that I mentioned earlier. So there are links in here you can go back and kind of explore these things on your own. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of some of the different funding programs. Again, I would encourage you to put questions or comments into the chat. We can circle back to some of these if people have specific questions about any funding programs during the Q&A. So as you take a look at these, if questions come to mind, let us know and we can come back to them. But I'll just give a quick rundown of a few of them. So Joe mentioned a few of these at the outset. In the state of Ohio, we have House Bill 2, also, or better known as the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Grant Program. So that is run through that Broadband Ohio office. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Again, there's a link to the program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now because the application window for grants recently closed, and they're considering right now projects kind of in the first funding round. So for those of you that have a project in, they are under consideration now, and we'll see what rolls out of that. But essentially, this is available to expand broadband service to unserved and underserved areas of the state, and can be done in partnership with internet service providers. And again, would encourage you to go check out the site and contact Peter or others at Broadband Ohio to find out more about that program. The one that we're going to spend, I think, a bit of time talking about with one of our panelists is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that one either right now. But the also known as RDOF, this is a funding source that goes to internet service providers essentially to subsidize the cost of building in rural areas where the market really just can't support the cost of building that high-speed internet infrastructure on its own. This is essentially a way to close that funding gap. And there was an auction for available territory. It's essentially a reverse auction. So the state ISPs or internet service providers bid on different areas of the state. And then whoever has the best bid or essentially needs the least subsidy wins the auction and has then kind of the right to build in that state and access those federal resources to support that. A few providers, including Spectrum, bid on and won large areas of the state of Ohio. And if you look at that link, you can actually see mapping to who won the auction in your areas of the state, which can be a really great way to think about coordinating with and reaching out to internet service providers and kind of understanding what their plans are and how your community can support that and hopefully advance getting that infrastructure built in your community. The next is we'll move on to the COVID recovery programs. There have been a lot of those. Within those several different funding packages, there have been even more programs, specific programs to support broadband. So you see a number of those listed here. I mentioned the emergency broadband benefit. So that's one that's available directly to residents. So essentially your role as a community leader or community member would be to increase awareness, encourage people to take advantage of that program. There are a few other funding programs where you'll want to work with partners, depending on who's eligible for the funds. For example, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, the third one there, is available to schools and libraries to build. Some of it is to build infrastructure and then also implement other ways to get people connected. So other strategies that tie into digital inclusion. So in those cases, to access those funds, you'll want to talk with your schools and libraries in your community and think about how you can partner if they're pursuing those. And then there are some that resources that directly fund infrastructure, the Broadband Infrastructure Program, the Capital Projects Fund, and the state and local recovery funds can all be used to build infrastructure. Each of those programs has its own parameters and its own guidelines and eligibility requirements. And we'll get to kind of how to figure those out in just a moment. Joe also gave a quick rundown of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, previously known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package. I want to call out three key pieces of that. So again, the just over $42 billion. First of all, let me just say, I mean, these are unprecedented numbers. These are incredibly exciting, just investment at a scale that we have never seen and probably will not see again anytime real soon in the broadband infrastructure space. This is kind of, I would liken this to the turn of the 20th century when we were electrifying the country and the amount of investment that went into electrification. This is that time right now. So you really want to be thinking about how to leverage the COVID dollars and then the Infrastructure Act funds. So that $42 billion for broadband deployment, you may hear this referred to as the BEAD program. It's the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. So if you hear BEAD, that's what it is. It's the $42.5 billion to build broadband infrastructure and roll that out. That is going to go through states. There is a formula for some, and there are also competitive grants. So some of that funding will go to states through formula funding. We have heard that at least $100 million will go to every state. Their rulemaking has not started yet, but what we've heard kind of the direction is that at a minimum, every state will be allocated $100 million, and then there will be some additional formula plus competitive grants on top of that. So really incredible numbers when we think about what has been available in the past. There's also a separate $1 billion pot specifically for middle mile broadband infrastructure. So I mentioned backbone, which is kind of if you think about this, use the metaphor of water and sewer, that's your trunk line or your main. And then middle mile is kind of the arteries coming off of that, and then last mile is essentially running from your tap from the street to someone's house. So that middle mile piece, getting from the backbone fiber out into communities, out into rural areas, that we know is very costly, is a big challenge, especially in rural areas. There's that pot of $1 billion to specifically support that. And then finally, the Digital Equity Act, that $2.75 billion, is entirely set aside for digital inclusion efforts. So again, that is thinking about how do we get devices to people that need them? How do we provide the technical support, the digital literacy training, and the other supports people need in order to be able to make use of this new infrastructure and opportunity that's coming to folks that may not have had it before. One other thing I will note is that states are required to have a broadband plan in place, and also required to have a digital equity plan in place to access the BEAD funds at $42.5 billion and to access the Digital Equity Act funds. Those will both be deployed through states, and then from there, states will need to have a plan in place. They will be looking to work with local communities. So one more plug to be in touch with the Broadband Ohio office to understand how your community can fit in and take advantage of that. And then there are a few other funding sources. We won't have time to get into all of those right now, but the ARC, Appalachian Region Commission, the USDA, you see a number there. But I want to call your attention to that last bullet point and the highlighted link there. This is really where I would suggest you spend your time. If you click on this link, the NTIA has a federal funding resource guide that is essentially going to break down all of those programs I showed you. So everything from RDOF all the way down through the rest of that list is all captured under this federal funding resource guide. You can search by different agency. You can search by different need within broadband. So if you want to look specifically for infrastructure, if you want to look specifically for certain digital inclusion efforts, you can break down that funding by all of these different categories and then see what programs are available to you. So there's even a filter specifically for rural communities. So this is a really great resource. I would suggest you turn your attention there. If you have follow-up questions, I am happy to answer them. I know Joe will be happy to answer them after we finish the webinar, but please put in your questions about any of these funding programs into the chat, and we can tackle them in the Q&A also. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and then we're going to move on to our other panelists. So to start, I want to welcome Joe Crone from Spectrum. Joe is the Vice President of Construction for Field Operations for the rural build for Charter Communications. In his more than 40 years in the business, the past 25 of which have been with Time Warner Charter, he's held numerous roles in the industry. So everything from working as an installer, technician, director of field engineer, senior director of construction, to his current role. Over the years, he's worked throughout Florida, Hawaii, Texas, New York, the Carolinas, and now Ohio, where he's overseen the expansion build for Charter's rural broadband for the past 5 years in Ohio. Joe's passion is teaching future leaders project management skills and building projects, seeing them from the beginning stages all the way through to completion. So let's welcome Joe, and we're going to hear about some of the work that Charter is engaged in building out in rural communities in Ohio. Welcome, Joe.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaron, and I appreciate it. And yes, you know, it's a big project, and as you mentioned earlier, we have a huge role at Charter Spectrum to play in this, and definitely want to be a great partner to the state of Ohio. And I just want to take us through some of the work that we have, and yeah, you referred to RDOF earlier, where Spectrum has been granted and awarded over 13,000 miles in the state of Ohio to build RDOF. So It's a huge project. My role in it is I've been the Senior Director of Construction for the state of Ohio and Kentucky for Southern Ohio region for the past 5 years. Just recently, about a year ago, I was elevated to this new role, and I'll take you through what we're doing because we're strictly focused and we got focus going through this project here we're talking about. So I'll try to, I could talk, I'm very passionate about this, so I could probably talk for hours on it, but I'll dummy it down for myself and try to keep us on track. So, you know, as you know, RDOF was awarded grants through Help Offset, getting rural broadband out to various areas through 24 states throughout the country. You know, we've got over 1 million homes with a $5 billion investment, and when you look at it, the infrastructure that we need to build is roughly going to be about 115,000 miles of plant. In my role, I oversee both Ohio and Kentucky. On the screen right now in the gray is where you see Charter's footprint right now. In the blue, you'll see where Charter has won the RDOF areas through the auction of where we're going to be building out throughout the entire country in the 24 states. This project here is broken down by 6 VPs. I'm one of those 6, and like I mentioned earlier, my responsibility is over Ohio, and I oversee Kentucky as well. You know, when you talk 115,000 miles of infrastructure, that's almost 4.5 times around the world. Aaron alluded to it a little bit earlier that, you know, we want to get out 1 gig to everybody, and that's our ultimate goal. Everything we are building is fiber to the home, pretty much that you saw in Aaron's first slide and in his diagram. We are building fiber through a network throughout the entire area, and we are going right directly to the home with fiber to the home. So you will see speeds of 1 gig and make your ultimately fast. Building infrastructure in the upcoming months, we're going to develop plans. That's already happened, and I'll take you through that a little bit. You know, we're required to service all the homes in the awarded census blocks that we build. Field walkout, and network planning is already in progress. Just to this point here, you know, I've been in my position for almost, it's been just about a year now, and Charter has gone ahead knowing that this is coming and formulated a team. I have a team in Ohio of 36 employees. I have a senior director that's focused strictly on Ohio. I have 4 managers, and we'll talk about the areas we cover and what we're going to cover, and just a little bit high level on our build plan. We've already walked out in preparation for this. We've already walked out over 2,500 miles and 20,000 passings already this year. And, you know, the project actually kicks off January 1. So we've got a lot done already, and I'll go a little bit more into that as we prepared our plans. And of course, it's timely execution. You know, we got to really build. We got to get there quick. We got to work with the pole owners. Over the last 6 months, I've held numerous meetings with the power companies to telling them we're coming, showing them the area within their footprint that we're coming, so that they're prepared to help us achieve our goals of building out throughout these rural communities, which is really the long pole in the tent. When it comes down, we start talking about, you know, the build and how getting out there. It's not actually the build time. The build is fairly, I don't want to make light of it, but it's fairly easy. I mean, when we got permits to go underground, we can run. If we can get aerial pole permits, you know, we get strand in the air and fiber in the air, we can really go fast. You know, and you know, roughly a crew could do about 2 miles a day aerial. When you start talking in the rural areas, you're talking, you know, anywhere 300-foot spans, you know, and you times that times 3 spans, and you're already at 1,000 feet. You're 1/5 of the way to finishing up a mile. So we can move quickly. No offense to the power companies. That's the process, and it's, you know, it's safety first. And, you know, when we talk with these power companies, they have when we submit them an application, we're submitting them thousands and thousands of poles. So when you think about a 13,000-mile build in the state of Ohio, you know, with and the underground portion, which is probably about 10% of that, 90% of this is aerial, which is the quickest way to go. you're talking to the power companies of, 20 poles per mile times 13,000 miles. That's a huge undertaking for both us and them, and they have a 45-day turnaround time to work on out in the field to look at those poles and tell us if, they'll support our cable, or do we have to pay for make ready and get make ready done. And then, of course, if there is make ready on those poles, then, they have another 60, 90 days to do the make ready work that needs to be done, whether it's changing out a pole or rearranging things on a pole. It takes a while. So, you're already probably looking at 120 days when you start doing the math before we can even start construction. To let you know, we're there already. We've already met with the pole owners. We've already submitted over 1,000 miles already to date of pole applications from our walkout, and we still continue to do. We're trying to stay 6 months ahead of the project, so that way, we're giving the power companies enough time. But then again, we got to be fast to market too, because people want internet and folks want internet now. They don't want to wait. It's a need and a desire. So, kind of touched on this. We got dedicated RF construction teams. I'm one of the 6 VPs. We've already hired all of our contractors. So all of our contractors were in place, and we did that back in March, April, and May. We did some onboarding with vendors, and we got contractors established, and we're all set with our contractors, so there's no contractor issues there. They have already established themselves in warehouses already across the state, and I'll just kind of hit on those here on a map in a few seconds. And we're real estate and planning. We really have no space acquisition really. All of our head ends and hubs today that we have in existing locations will support everything. And we've also worked with Brian and his team to work on any, contracts or anything legal that we would think we would run into throughout the next, what they're calling it is the next 6 years. And I'll deep dive into that here shortly. Our requirements from the FCC for this build out. The clock starts January 1st, 2021 and runs through December 31st, 2027. Our goal here is that we have to have 40% of the state passings completed within the first 3 years, and then 20% every year after. We know at Charter, at Spectrum, that this is a challenge, and when I say a challenge, that people don't want to wait too long. And we are doing everything we can to expedite this project plan, and that's my role where I play. What I play in this is how can we get this done faster, quicker, and I think by, not just waiting till January 1st, 2021 to get started with this project, but actually getting out there, 9 months ahead of time, putting staff together, hiring the contractors, getting the materials in, getting the walkout done, talking with the power companies. We've already submitted applications to the power companies. We are 6 months ahead already right now on our applications to the power companies. And as they churn those pole make ready, whether it is make ready or not make ready, and they churn those back to us, we're going to have a good rolling amount of work in front of us that we can go faster. So, not committing to it or not quoting it, but we're looking more at December 31st, 2025 of being done in the state of Ohio. I've already got plans laid out to cut this back to a 4-year project versus a 6-year project to the FCC's requirements. So everything is by the state level, not by the census block level. So we have to have 40% of the state built out. And of course, once we release these addresses or release a census block, our field ops folks have 10 business days from a request for service to get service to those customers right away. So just at a high level, you can see this is the 115,000 miles that I was talking about earlier. My responsibility is right here in the state of Ohio and Kentucky. When you look at the 13,332 miles, roughly, the FCC says there's about 112,000 locations out there that we've won, and miles per month that we would need to do is about 185. That's to meet the 7-year project. We think there's probably I think there's about 277 we need to do a month starting in the second quarter of next year, so that we can hit our goal of 2025. And I think you, Aaron, alluded to it a little earlier. how many passings per location. There's probably about 8.57 passings per location. So, definitely, the need for a subsidy or something to help us build that, because the cost per mile to build is just outrageous to get to one homer, or like 5 to 7 homes per mile. But with the FCC helping, or the government helping us and offsetting that cost, it makes it a more attractive build solution. On the screen right now, you can see in the state of Ohio, everything in the dark blue is where we service today. Everything in the teal color that you see here is our RDOF footprint that we're going to build out for RDOF. And there's some little blue spots in here. That's just water within the state of Ohio. So you can see we have a huge undertaking to build. And then, of course, where you see this white space here, there's either another service provider, or like Aaron was mentioning before, we're partnering and working with and talking with some of the counties or all of the counties throughout the entire state. What can we do to help fill this in? Because if we're out there building this in this area, and I'm just using this as an example, this white space that's there, they need service too. If there's no other provider, how do we build that too at the same time? How can we partner with the counties? How can we, get additional state grants and other grants to help build that out while we're out there, so that way it's a one-shot, one-time deal that we can get right through there and not spot around and spot pick where we're building. I've got this map here, which kind of shows you our RDOF throughout the entire state of Ohio. I'm going to kind of move. Go to my. Let me pull in my better map here so you can see. I apologize. This is a little bit easier to look at and reader friendly. But this is the state of Ohio. Everything you see in blue is the RDOF area throughout the state that we have won. And, I just kind of focus more in central Ohio, but we do have area up in the northern Cleveland area, up in this area as well. I could also turn on what you're going to see here in red. What you're going to see here in red is our existing service area today. We do service in this area too. I don't have those maps to show you, but more or less we're focusing in on the central part of the state. And you can see that in these green areas here, those are called white space. That's what Aaron was alluding to earlier, the non-RDOF areas that either somebody else could have won this area, or there's another provider there, or this was just not in the auction from the FCC at the first go around. So this is where Brian and team and myself are all partnering with our local communities, with our local counties, to talk about what can we do and what is the cost. We've already done a lot of analysis on that, and you can see in some of these areas, what does it take to build out some of these white space areas where we don't service today. In a nutshell, it's a huge project. We think if we could do 3,000 miles a year for the next 4 years, that we can be very successful. There's a lot to build, a lot of area. Like I mentioned earlier, let me turn some of this off so it doesn't sound clutter. But like I mentioned earlier, we've broken these down, as you can see here, into clusters. So we have a contractor here that has 5,000 miles worth to build. They have this northern area and this area. They're based in the Zanesville area. We have another contractor over here based in the Jackson-Colton area that will cover this. We have another contractor that's based in the Lynchburg area that will cover this area, as well as the Kenton area. And we're not just starting on one part of the state here to say, we're going to build here and then work our way to another area. We are working throughout the entire state. So when I turn on, when I turn this on, you can see this is where we're working right now in the green. This is what we've walked out, or just about finished walking out, and where our construction is starting to as well. We try to start construction in the quickest win possible, and what that means is, where do we have existing fiber? I think Aaron alluded to it a little bit earlier on some of the other things where you could leverage some existing network. We're leveraging on our own network to fill in holes. So where we service today, we're looking at where do we have available fiber, where can we go? And then plus we were spreading this around on power companies. There's There's a ton of power companies in the state of Ohio. We don't want to just overdo it with the AEPs or the DP&Ls or AES, excuse me, or the South Central Power. You know, we're working with, you know, Mid-Ohio Electric. We're working with Washington Electric. We're working with Guernsey Muscom. You know, we're working with every power company and spreading our permits around all at the same time so that we're working with all the power companies together at one time, so that we're not excluding anybody and we can keep moving. So we're not overdoing it with AEP, and we're spreading in this area. We have, I think, it's actually 4 power companies in this area we're working with. Same thing down here. There's about 3 of them, and then you've got others in these areas. This is mostly AES, but we'll start getting to South Central soon as well too. So really, that's it from me in an overview of you know, the RDOF plans, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions or anything later on in the meeting.
Great, thank you, Joe. And we're going to move on to our other panelist, Horton Hobbs. Horton has served as Vice President of Economic Development for the Greater Springfield Partnership since 2012. In his position, he works closely with local economic development partners to assist existing businesses, attract new businesses, develop real estate, and aggressively market their community. Horton's previous work experience includes positions as development officer for the Springfield Foundation, Executive Director of the Center City Association, Planning Director for the City of New Carlisle, and a Regional Planner for the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. He's got a bachelor's degree in geography from Wittenberg University and a master's in geography and urban and regional planning. I like that last one, from Miami University. And welcome, Horton.
Thanks, Aaron. And thank you, everybody. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we're supposed to be wrapping up in about 9 minutes, which is what I have on my schedule. So I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to present my entire slide deck, but I will make it available for anybody who would like it. I'm going to try to share my screen quickly. I'll just show you one map, and we'll fill in from there. So let me go ahead and present. Hopefully, change the view here. Hopefully you have a map that shows, this is through Connected Nation, Innovate Ohio, and this was updated through 2020, or at least through March of 2020. And we used this, our county staff used this to kind of outline and fill in some of the areas that were just discussed, some of the white areas. And so when the CARES Act funding became available, we used the CARES Act dollars. The county allocated $3 million of the CARES Act dollars specifically for build out of the Spectrum network in these areas. And it's to fill in the underserved or unserved areas of the community. And to be very honest with you, this was really a strategy that was supporting our extensive job growth that's occurred in our community. Over 9,000 new jobs have been created in the last 7 or 8 years. And we have unprecedented new housing starts. And so in order for us to leverage that, we really had to get very specific with our strategy around accessibility, both affordably, but also just on a network. And quite frankly, because Spectrum was so built out in the community already, it was a great fit. And kudos to our Clark County staff, community development staff. They reached out to Spectrum directly, and we had been working as a Chamber of Commerce with Spectrum as well on other issues, and it was a perfect marriage. But it all started because we had done community planning. We had a comprehensive land use plan that identified extension of broadband and internet access throughout the community as one of its primary goals. And so, as you can see, hopefully on this slide, we now are starting to get the rural areas of the county completely saturated. Again, the county used about $3 million of CARES Act funding, and that should end. That build out should be done at the end of the first quarter of 22. And the county and Spectrum are currently working through another grant, and the county's already pledged another $3 million that would go toward ultimately the overall expansion into the entire the rest of the county. So, I think I guess my message, the message I would send to this audience is, and it's really an echo of what Aaron said before. Start with good planning, and when you do good planning, obviously this comes as a bias as a planner. When you do good planning, you stand prepared when there's opportunities. And as tragic and terrible as the pandemic has been for our state and our country and the world, frankly, it provided an opportunity through the CARES Act funding to make a difference in the lives of people that live in our communities. And remote work has become ever more important now, which has also been a part of our overall strategy of getting people to return to work in our community. And having a strong broadband or just a reliable and affordable access to internet service is a selling point when we're looking at housing expansion. So with that, I'm gonna stop short. The slides I've already sent to the team, and if anybody would like them, I'm sure they can send those out to you. It would give you some good background on why we are doing what we're doing and how we got to this point. But we don't have time for that. So let's. I'll be happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer any questions that may be available, that may be asked. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Horton. And I actually want to. So we have about 5 minutes left. If anybody does have any last questions, please put them in the chat. Horton, I want to start out with a question to follow up on what you just shared. Have you found any unexpected partners or champions in the community that were really key to advancing your efforts that maybe weren't the obvious? The ISPs and the local governments are maybe come to mind first, but were there any other partners that came to the table that you were surprised that were really key in your work?
No, not really. To be honest with you, to me, the biggest surprise was the county. Quite honestly, they're a great partner. They're a huge funder to our organization, and we're seamlessly integrated with our work, but we're separate. We're, a quasi public-private partnership. And so them putting $3 million in the first tranche, or 2.95, and then $3 million again committed, that is A, entrepreneurial, B, a strong sign of leadership, and they pushed the envelope. They decided to do it. They went through all the legal hoops, certainly, but they took some risk in doing it, and that's pretty awesome. We've had residents that call and ask when they can get on the line and on the services, and really it's been a pretty seamless process from that perspective. And the other thing I would say too, in fairness, we are a rural community, yes, but we do have a large urban area. And as you saw on the map, we were served fairly well to begin with. So I think through that planning process that we undertook all through 2017 into 2018 in our comprehensive plan, Connect Clark County, we got all that feedback. And so during that process, we assigned leaders for these areas, and our organization in the county were the ones chosen. So no, I mean, it was just really people doing what they said they were going to do, which has been very refreshing.
Great. Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Question for Joe. Joe, we talked about a lot of funding out there, and the work that you all are doing is incredibly impressive. But 13,000 miles of line is a lot to build, and there was a lot of blue on that map of where you plan to roll out. So for individual communities that are on this call, is there something, what can counties or individual villages or cities or townships do to make themselves a priority, or to make themselves as prepared as possible to work with you all to roll out infrastructure in their communities? Is there one thing that you would say they could do to assist you all?
No, I think, it comes down to partnering with that community, pretty much like Horton said. We've partnered with Clark County in that area, and we were focused to build that area. And we had, we set timelines, and that's really where we know we ought to achieve our goals. And we're trying to build out everything we can, but we can't overwhelm the power companies, and it's just a process. And I'm not blaming the power companies at all. It's just a process, and it's more about weight loading, wind loading, safety, ice loading, and then of course getting the make ready and the work done. So we've worked with the power companies to make additional contractors available that do work in the power space. But I think it's really partnering and looking at some of this white space. So we know what we have for RDOF today, but it's partnering with the counties where, you know, if they're looking to fill in those white spaces, and if we could do it at the same time, we can wipe it, you know, we can get it all done in one fast area, you know, could cover the entire area.
Can I add one more thing, Aaron, quickly?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
And I know we're running out of time, but one point that I think it's really important, I believe. We have private sector investment in our counties, i.e. Spectrum, but there are other providers, frankly. And there can be a temptation at times especially when there's big tranches of resources like we have now, for municipalities or governmental entities to want to build and buy and build their own infrastructure. And I would strongly discourage communities from doing that. We've seen that with other utilities, whether it be power or other, where there's a temptation and sometimes a need to do that. Here is the best time I've ever seen in my 25 plus year career where we can truly leverage private investment by offsetting it with public dollars to keep it affordable for communities to do this. And I certainly hope that communities see this as an opportunity to partner with the private sector rather than to build out their own infrastructure that over time is hard to sustain and hard to maintain. So that to me has been the secret of the success in Clark County and why this will be sustainable long term. So I feel it's very important as an ex-government person to make the point that this is a great opportunity to really leverage public-private partnership.
Yeah, the partnership is definitely a key element to making this work. So we are at time for today. If folks do have follow-up questions, please feel free to email us at MORPC, and we'll be happy to get answers out to you. And as a few of us have said, we'll make the slides available to everyone, and hopefully those will be resources that you all can use. Thank you for joining us today. This is certainly an exciting time for this work, and we look forward to working with you all and supporting your work in your communities going forward. So thank you and have a great weekend. And I think with that, we will wrap up.
Thank you.